the role of the other books. So we just walked through the backbone of the Old Testament story. The Old Testament story is a story from Genesis to Kings, from Eden to exile. That is the main storyline of the entire Old Testament. Okay? Yet, if you look at it, the end of Kings, there are a lot of other books in the Old Testament. And so what do those other books do? And this would be my quickest take I could have on this for you, okay? So the other books, especially if you're following the Hebrew order, after the books of Kings, you would go to what we would think of as the prophets. Books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, or the book of the 12. Those books, what do they do, okay? For one thing, they do not carry the story forward in the sense of just from Genesis to Kings, it's just one consecutive story. Chronologically, just straight in order, right? The prophets actually, for the most part, fit in various places within that story. And even the prophets are not arranged chronologically. Like, so some are prophesying in the 800s, some in the 600s, some in the 400s. You know, it's all over the place. But the thing is, what do they do? Or how do those books relate to this story or contribute to the story? The quickest answer I think I could give is to say that the prophets add like God's perspective or God's commentary on the story that you read about. So like, what was God thinking? What was he saying to the people during these stories? What was in his heart as these things were going on? You find his heart, his words in the prophets and what they were doing and what they were telling the people. Now, what exactly were the prophets preaching? They were preaching the same thing that the great prophet Moses preached. They preached basically the book of Deuteronomy, calling the people to heart obedience, and they specifically preach Deuteronomy 27 through 30, which is to say, remember that's the blessings and the curses section and the prophecies of what would happen. They'd go into the land, they'd be blessed, they'd rebel, they'd be exiled, and one day God would bring them back and bless them again. They basically preach that. And so if it's before they're kicked out of the land, they are warning. The prophets are warning the people, don't do this, because God's going to kick you out of the land and destroy the temple one day if you do this. But if they are actually exiled when the prophets are writing, the prophets are saying, turn back to the Lord. This happened because we wouldn't listen. But if we'll turn back, there's hope for us of restoration. God will change us. He'll change our destiny. He'll bring us back to the land, like Moses prophesied. This is basically what the prophets do. And so you can read them in relationship to the story, and you'll get greater understanding of especially God's side of what's going on in the main story. Now, there's other books, though, than the prophets, right? There's books that we call like the wisdom books, like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, books like this. Those books, I think, add perspective for us, or information for us, or shed light on life within the story. Like, how does life work best? What can we expect life to be like? What was God's will for the citizens of his kingdom in the story? And so, for example, you read the book of Proverbs and you find out this is how life typically works. This is what God wants from you as an individual. This is what God wants from the community. And this is what you can expect. Now, it doesn't always work this way, but this is what you can expect. If you obey the Lord, you'll see these kinds of blessings. If you disobey, you'll experience this kind of consequences. This is how God has ordered the world, and this is how he's ordered his community. This is what living rightly or righteously looks like, living in the fear of the Lord. But then you read a book like Job, and you realize, wait a second, Job is a righteous man, but he doesn't get the good stuff, the good life that Proverbs talks about. He gets a bunch of suffering. And you realize, wait a second, somebody might not get the good stuff. Maybe they'll actually suffer. I can't conclude that if they're suffering, they must not be living a righteous life. Because Job pushes back on that. Job was living a righteous life, and he suffered because God had greater purposes for Job. God was doing things that Job never even knew about. You read a book like Ecclesiastes, on the other hand, and here's Solomon talking about how he got everything. He pursued all of the things of the good life, But none of them satisfied him. Why? Because his heart wasn't right with the Lord. What really matters is not getting the good things. What matters first and foremost is fearing God, keeping His commandments, and just enjoying whatever it is that God gives us to enjoy. The work, the relationships that He's given to us. You could have all the good things and be completely empty if you don't have the relationship with the Lord. And then you read books like Song of Solomon, and you realize the beauty of the sexual relationship and the pleasures of life that God has given to His people. And it's interesting that Solomon writes that, even though this ended up being an area that was his downfall. But God has blessed this relationship. This is all giving us perspective on life within the story. But then you read a book like Psalms, and you find from Psalms that there are some people who actually get the heart of God. They realize that we are created to worship God, and they love God with all their hearts. And so you read the Psalms and you realize we need to submit our lives to God's words and to God's Son, and we need to worship God. We need to love Him, and the psalmists do love Him. And that doesn't mean their life is easy, because a lot of times the Psalms are written from great suffering and struggles, and yet they keep coming back to God, and they keep worshiping God and wrestling with God because they love God and want to know God. But as you read, especially through the second half of the Psalms, you realize that those who really have God's heart don't just want to worship God themselves. They want to call all the nations to worship God with them. This is the kind of things we see in the Psalms. But at the end of the Old Testament, when it's all said and done, there is no throne for David. It seems like his dynasty has been cut down at the roots. It seems like there is no hope for the world, because the whole hope of the world is in the offspring of David. But then you read in certain of the prophets, especially ones like Isaiah, and you read that even when it seems like David's line has been chopped down, there will be a shoot that'll come out of the stump of Jesse from David's line. David's dad's name was Jesse. And God will raise up another son of David someday. To us a son will be given, a son will be born, the government will be on his shoulders, on the throne of David he'll sit forever. He'll be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of His government and of His reign there'll be no end. God will do this. He is completely committed, even when it seems like there's no hope, to do what He's promised. And when God raises up that son someday, everything's going to change, because He's going to rule in righteousness, and the world will be changed, and there'll be no more sorrow, there'll be no more sadness, there'll be no more of the sins and the consequences that we have felt throughout the whole Old Testament story, and that we continue to feel every day. We just need to wait on the Lord to do what He said He would do, and to raise up that Son of David for us.